Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this first Foil Fireside chat. The intention behind this programme is that we identify firms that are offering services we think will be of interest and value to Foil member firms, and we will gently probe and try to get under the skin of exactly what it is they're offering as a way of helping support Foil members' businesses to understand what's available in the market and which firms are supplying those services. So I'm joined this afternoon by Paul Brett and Derek Burke from CUBRO, and also alongside me is Mark Huxley, who is working with Foil and London Foil to help support both of those insurance markets. So I think probably first thing to do would be if Paul and Derek, you could just very briefly say a bit about yourselves and your company and where you fit into to the organisation. We'll start with you, Paul.
Yeah, no problem. So, and hello to Lawrence and to Mark, and again to all your members as well. My name's Paul Brett. So I'm responsible for CUBRO's business in the UK. So we work with obviously local partners, we work with our customers, and I also work actually with international partners as well. So we work with people, for example, like Nokia Networks, Ericsson, people like McAfee, actually Fortinet, various other sort of leading security vendors, and our technology sort of adds value to their solution sets. So my responsibility actually is to help develop those relationships and grow our business in the UK.
Fantastic. Thanks, Paul. And Derek.
Yeah, I'm a support and solution engineer for CUBRO, so I tend to work with technical support, pre-sales, post-sales support. I also do some work with our marketing team, adding a little bit of technical flavor to some of the marketing documents that we publish and put out, as well as tutorial videos and the such. So I wear a few hats, but it's all generally around making things work and recommendations to the customer.
Okie doke. So against that backdrop, where do you typically see issues with an organisation's network, and what sort of gaps do you see there?
It's an interesting question, Lawrence. I think that the fundamental target always is the data, that is anywhere within an organisation's infrastructure, and of course an IT system, an IT environment is comprised of a number of different parts. So there are potentially a number of gaps in that environment, but of course they're all interconnected. So there are, it's really what is the lowest common denominator. It's probably worth maybe just putting the security aspects into a bit of context as well, in terms of what's the size and shape of a security threat, and what's the impact of security these days. And I'm sure you may have seen yourselves in the past, there's some really good studies that are done by a number of organisations these days. IBM do one annually, which is sort of a report on what they have seen of security breaches over the previous 12 months. But our government, the UK government, publishes reports and so on. And generally, I would say across those reports, the principles are pretty much in line. And what I'll talk about today, you'll find some of the numbers might not necessarily apply to specific environments in your or specific members' environments, but the principles are pretty true, typically, I would say.
Okay.
And the sorts of things that are quite interesting when you look at it, and things like the average cost of a data breach. And so looking across on that IBM report, they looked across and it was 17 different market sectors across 17 different countries, and the average cost of a data breach was just over $4 million. Which is very interesting. Yeah, I mean, big numbers. As I say, I don't want to sort of be a scaremonger on these, because it's very relevant, obviously, to the organisation, and that's the average number. Actually, it splits out between enterprise and sort of smaller enterprise. So larger enterprise is the average. The average cost was, I think, over $5 million, where with a smaller organisation it was just over $1 million, something like that.
So a couple of quick questions just springing to mind. What when you say a small enterprise or a large enterprise,
Mm.
what kind of turnover are you thinking on that division?
Yeah, well, I would say probably, you know, a larger, and you've really got smaller than mid-size and then larger. I would say sort of larger is anything probably over about £500 million turnover, something
Right.
like that. I would
Right.
say below
Yeah.
that is probably medium, and then smaller obviously is anywhere from a self-employed single person agency of of some type.
Sure.
Um,
And how is that sort of £4 to £5 million cost of a data breach? I appreciate it's an average, but do you have any kind of breakdown on that? I mean, how does it cost that much money?
Yeah, and it's, I mean, again, it's very interesting. And you will probably see again reported, these numbers in slightly different ways, depending upon what the content of the number is made up of. So that particular number, for example, that sort of consists of the costs comprise of the cost for sort of detection and isolation. So finding the problem in the first place, and then being able to identify what the problem is. Lost business, of course, and the lost business can come about for a couple of different reasons. While if a system goes down, if your IT systems are caused to go down while that problem is being resolved, then there potentially is lost revenue there. But also things like lost reputation can cause you to lose customers. And also, actually, interestingly, and there is a number that I've got somewhere, whereas the cost of sale for those organisations typically go up after a breach, because of the damaged credibility, they have to pay more to win new customers after the event, which is interesting. But a couple of other points would be things like notification. That's another component of that cost. And that's being able to obviously notify users and customers of that security breach, and then post-breach response. So how do they resolve that problem, and how do they improve things going forward, and how do they work with their customers and users and potentially the supply chain as well to manage that and improve it going forward.
Well, actually, if you don't mind, a couple of questions from me, because you talked about the timing. I mean, I know you've said in other conversations the length of time from occurrence to discovery and reporting. We're in hundreds of days here, so one assumes that's got some kind of correlation to this cost.
Yeah, yes, it does. I mean, it's interesting. Again, is the average time to discover and resolve a security breach this last year was 287 days, so just under 10 months. I mean, it's fascinating. That sort of broke down into, I think it was about 212 days to actually identify there had been a breach, and then I think it was about 75. I think if my maths are right, it's about 75 to get to the 287 to actually resolve the problem. So you can sort of, I guess, view that as the analogy being you've got a burglar in your house who hides for 10 months and you don't know they're there, but every time you go out, they're looking through your confidential information and selling that off or doing whatever they are with it over that period of time. And I guess the point with that is because we often have this perception that a security breach is a one-off event, and it happens quite quickly. So we have somebody attack our IT environment, they gain access, you retrieve whatever it is they're after, and then move on. But that typically isn't the case. And that, as you say, is also why those costs can be quite significant, because if you think that exfiltration of that confidential information has taken place over a sustained period of time.
So using your burglar analogy, how are they getting in the house? What are the access points that they're finding?
There are, I mean, again, it's interesting. There are a number of what we call them attack vectors. And if you know anything about IT, we love our acronyms and terminology and so on.
That's not unique to IT, Paul.
So we call them an attack vector, which is how do they get in? And again, that's really interesting, and it's a combination of people and technology. Actually, when you look at again in that report, it shows a top 10 attack vectors that we used. The number one was compromised credentials, interestingly, but number two was phishing, what we call phishing, and those are those emails that we all receive that have typically or often have that very strange looking email address to them, but they're clearly made out to look like they come from an official source, whether that's your bank or whether it's I don't know, some streaming service or a store or whatever. And they're often given away, of course, aren't they, by that very fake looking email address. But many of them don't look like they absolutely look authentic. And so that's actually, the number two attack vector. The other interesting one, actually, I found it, when you look at, where the costs are and how they get access into the systems, is that the attack vector that costs the most money is compromised email credentials, which is interesting. It isn't actually the number one attack vector. It's down at about number 8 or 9, interestingly, but it costs a lot more. And the reason is it's much harder to find because they're entering the system with valid credentials. So they're just much harder to detect. Any of those, the technologies and systems and people would, if they saw them at first glance, would see them as being legitimate credentials. So it's just harder to find. So there are a number of attack vendors, and I guess coming back to your original question, Lawrence, which was about, so where are the gaps? It is that they're typically, if there are going to be gaps, they will tend to be where there's connectivity, going on with other systems. So we have, obviously, in an IT environment, there's normally some type of network connecting different devices together, whether that's in one building or multiple buildings, or indeed through a public service like a public cloud or whatever. And obviously the connections to that are maybe to your supply chain, or it could be, or it could be, to customers as well. So it's normally where there's some interconnectivity going on, which tend to be the most vulnerable parts. But actually, as I mentioned earlier, it's the lowest common denominator, and because of the interconnectedness of IT systems and people, it's the lowest common denominator of risk. So it's actually people and technology, policies and procedures and training of people is important, as well as applying the right technologies to provide the right level of security for an IT environment.
So Derek, just picking that point up,
Mm-hmm.
let's dig into the CUBRO toolbox then. So how do you attach yourself to the organizations that you work with?
Sure. So CUBRO's core competency, the products that we offer, fall into a category of technology known as network visibility. So to make a metaphor for how that works, that's basically the plumbing that connects all of the security tools together, getting information from the network itself to those security tools. So we think about any number of security tools. We're talking about things like intrusion detection systems, firewalls, these things that help either block potentially malicious traffic or disallowed traffic, or things that, if something happens to get through, we're trying to detect what that activity is so we can identify it and then remediate it. Where we come in is those tools, for example, they can only do their job if they have the information to do their job. So their output is only as good as their input. And this is what we refer to. There's a couple levels to this, but in any network, there's going to be blind spots. And that could be something created by new technology, such as a couple of years ago, virtualization was the big thing. Now moving forward, everything is cloud deployments. We're getting into things that these containerized environments, which are sort of a smaller sort of virtualized instance that lives out in servers in the cloud, or it could be on premises. But our job as the visibility vendor is to gather all the information from these different places and send it to the security tools so that they can actually observe everything that's happening on the network. So we're tying all of that together. And how we do that is through a few different kinds of technology. The first is referred to as TAPS. Again, acronyms, that stands for Test Access Point. But if we think of it like a phone tap, it's really the same thing. So these are passive elements that will connect to the network itself, and they will copy the traffic off. And that copied traffic will go to another piece of technology we offer that we generally refer to as a network packet broker. This is sort of a centralized piece of hardware that collects all of these different data feeds from across the network. And then at that point, it can filter and allocate that traffic as necessary to the different security elements. So if we're looking at something to say, for example, a web application firewall really only cares about web traffic. So why do we want to overburden it with traffic that is not web-based traffic. At the network packet broker, we can select only the web traffic and then forward it to the web application firewall. Likewise, we can send only relevant traffic to other systems, other deployments, or we can send all of it to something like maybe you have a packet recording appliance that just spools all that traffic for forensic analysis later. So from the centralized hub, the packet broker, we can allocate all of this traffic collected from across the network to these different devices. That's our core competency in what we do.
Okay. I mean, if you were starting from scratch with a firm, what would you sort of counsel them to start to build in terms of what does good practice sort of look like, and what kind of structures might you want to see in place? I mean, that's probably an unfair question because that's not the real world. I guess in most cases you're not kind of involved with companies from the get-go, but in the theoretical world, if you were building processes and systems to have the best security you possibly could, what would that look like? What would your best practice look like in those cases?
Sure. I mean, this is a conversation that's that you could have for hours on end. But if I were to break it down, I'd say there's two elements primarily to this. The first one being, as Paul alluded to, getting that sort of culture of security in place in your company. And this doesn't necessarily mean turning everybody into a security expert, but just being a little bit more maybe skeptical or diligent of those emails that are coming in, maybe doing a little bit more validation on something before you click on that link. Just training up your employees, building those policies, and then rewarding that security-minded behavior. Of course, security is always in support of the business, so it can't be the overriding factor, but just being aware of the different, I suppose, the different attack vectors and how they can compromise your institution. This is the first step. So getting those policies in place, training your people, making them aware of the risks and the costs and the fallout. And then what can they do to sort of help mitigate this? Now, the second level, I think, comes down more to where we sit, and this is the hardware level. So Paul, he put the example out of one of the most common attack vectors are legitimate credentials, like email credentials that compromise a system. Part of that goes back to the policy aspect of things. Use more complex passwords. You don't want your password to be CUBRO 2021, for example, in our case, right? That would be not the best idea. But once we get that out of the way, let's assume that an attacker is still able to compromise something. They get in with valid credentials. Well, how do you detect that? Because it looks like normal behavior. This is where we come in, where by collecting the traffic from across the network and sending it to the security tools that you would have deployed, such as your intrusion detection system or these other systems, you can see this activity taking place on the network. So maybe you got in with valid credentials, but there's this concept in hacking or penetration testing with the white hat good guys. It's called lateral movement. So we get into a system that doesn't have, say, the privileges that we need to access the information we want, but that can serve as a jumping off point to another system in the network. And here's where we can start to detect network anomalies or things that just shouldn't be the case. For example, why is Sue in accounting? Why is her computer trying to make connections to, our programming database or where our intellectual property lives? That doesn't make sense.
Yes.
With our visibility layer attached to the tools, this gives those tools the opportunity to correlate these activities, detect them, and then upon detecting that, we can say this is not normal behavior. This needs to be investigated, and we can remediate that.
And I think I would just add to that, Lawrence, as well, is that, and the overriding theme with this, I would say, is that security, I guess, has to be a normal business practice now, because it's continual and it's ongoing, and it's now a component of the ability to do business, because the consequences of not getting it right, of course, can be so significant. Which is why I want to just put some of that context around it earlier. The consequences can be significant, so it has to become, and increasingly now is a normal business practice. So there's sort of, again, probably two parts of that, as Derek had mentioned. There's the people and the processes. So the people need to be, employees need to be maybe more aware of security, or that aware of it as part of a process. There is a balance, actually, of course, as well, is the organisation needs to be able to do business. So there's a balance between how much security you need to apply, according to whether that is too intrusive, that actually just stops you being able to function as a business. So there is a bit of a balance there. But there's people and process, and then there's technology that gets applied as well. And in the market, there are multiple technology manufacturers that have what we refer to as security tools, which are devices that do a particular job to protect from certain types of security attacks. And very much now the approach from a technology point of view, in terms of best practice, and again come back to your original point, I guess, is that we very much see it as a layered approach as far as technology is concerned. Actually, if you add people to it, that's another layer as well. But from a technology point of view, it tends to be a layered approach. And what I mean by that is it's multiple devices deployed to ensure that they cover each of the potential attack vectors within an organisation. So if I sort of draw the analogy, it's a little bit like, I was thinking of it as a bit like the nightclub and so on. So you have your first level of security, which is the door person at the front door, and what they're doing, of course, is scanning somebody wanting to come in, just to see are there any characteristics about that person that they feel is a threat to the organisation, and therefore, of course, will reject people at that point or allow people in. And that's very similar to a security tool that we call a firewall. And that's basically what that does. It sits at the perimeter and says you can come in or you can't come in. The problem is then with some malware, some attack vectors, they can be made to look presentable at the door, but start to misbehave when they get inside. So there are other technologies available that are deployed to actually a little bit, again, like the what would you call them, security crowd security people in inside the nightclub that are just watching the crowd there to make sure everybody's behaving themselves. There are technologies of a similar type that then look inside a network to see if any particular programs are starting to misbehave or not behave correctly. And then there are other technologies that get deployed to protect certain points within an IT environment. And again, very similar to like you might have with, certainly with a till, or where the money's kept in a nightclub, that's going to be at least under lock and key and probably a code and things like this. But things like the bathrooms and so on, there may be some control points there. So it's very, very similar in IT. What we look to do is have very specialized tools to address very, very particular threats. And there isn't really a silver bullet. It's a combination of those. If you then add to that the people and process, that's another layer again to give you really the comprehensive approach to security. And that becomes the business as usual approach to security.
Yeah, I think they're called spotters, those people that are inside the nightclub looking out for people.
Right, okay.
No troublemakers, spotters. Sorry, Mark, I cut across here, but I just not to break the theme, but I just wanted to ask, I absolutely get your point about balancing security, which from the people and process point of view can slow a business down a little bit with the need to protect that business from these types of threats in the first place. But is there any delay brought into the business by having the type of tech oversight product that you're describing? So is there any compromise to the speed of data moving around when your product is in use?
I would say, and I'm not interested obviously in Derek's view of this. My personal, that generally no. There at an individual level you might get very slight delays every now and then. Actually, as we all see, you might sometimes get on your own PC, an email coming in, or you're sending an email, and it just seems to take, I don't know, just a half a second or something before it gets transmitted or it's accepted for receipt. And often that's your antivirus software just checking it for its content. So it's very low level and very small. It's not a large noticeable delay, or shouldn't be, if the systems are set up correctly and applied correctly. Would you say that's a fair comment, Derek?
Yeah, I suppose it could be depending on the context of the question. Perhaps there's two different answers. I think from a hardware deployment standpoint, such as these tools going into place, and especially the visibility layer connecting all of them, it should not create any noticeable impact to day-to-day business operations.
Okay.
And perhaps the biggest impact that you would notice is because something was detected and stopped, which kind of brought things to a pause while that's addressed. But otherwise, I don't think from a technology standpoint that you should really be noticing any interruption. But then the other side of this is, again, in the scope of the question, it's kind of a much larger, I don't know the best way to say it, but there's a lot more to it than that. I mean, companies spend decades putting together practices and teams to streamline this as much as possible. So that really comes down to the implementation phase. Now, some of the things that are deployed on the network, such as the visibility layer or specific tools, can really help streamline those processes so that they don't interrupt as much. But I think that that can come back to how well implemented is your culture of security and your processes as well. If it is more of a business native sort of way of doing things, then probably very little interruption. But there are definitely instances where you could have conflict in the actual security teams versus the other elements of the business, and this could potentially cause delays, and really I would say that's the sign of perhaps something that needs to be reevaluated and looked at. So
Okay.
sorry to kind of like meander off there, but
No. Well, actually, Derek, funny, the point I was going to get into when Lawrence was talking there was actually about culture ultimately, because obviously, you said before about having this balance between the day-to-day operation of the business and making sure that can still run and putting these security controls over the top. And I guess where my culture question goes is, those that see the benefit will buy the service, the budget holders that you're going to be talking to. But I'm kind of interested on the user level of it, the take up, the awareness, the training that needs to go in, and going all the way back to when Paul was introducing what an organization looks like now and some of the fragile points of entry. We all live in very complex working environments with a lot of suppliers, a lot of third parties, a lot of remote workers now, a lot of people using bring your own devices and stuff like that. So I was just kind of intrigued to dig around a little bit further into user take up, training that you put into the organizations, and that kind of corporate conduct risk of where you're getting to the outlier regions of your organization. How do you make sure you've got that same standard of rigor as you've got in the core center?
That's a good question. Again, this kind of comes back to maybe if we could break down the question, I can try to address it a little bit more pointedly. As you point out, that we have a very different working environment than we did before. So this definitely creates more complexity in terms of being able to monitor the network effectively and make sure that we are seeing or detecting all activity that we should. Back when everybody was working on premises with corporate systems that were, whether it was your desktop or your laptop that was given to you, things were much more simplified then because you really had to define what we refer to as a network perimeter. So we could say, everything outside of that perimeter, this is not trusted information. Everything inside of this perimeter is assumed to be good, although we still put these tools in place to make sure that perimeter is the separation point between the outside world and the internal workings of the company. As you point out, now we have a lot more technology that people are bringing into the environment. So you have your mobile devices. I mean, these are tiny little computers. They have storage. They have network connectivity. They are a prime vector for potentially bringing bad things in. and then whether knowingly or not, taking valuable information that shouldn't leave the environment out of the environment. In that respect, what I can say is that there are definitely systems that are designed to specifically address mobile technology and bring your own device kind of technology, mobile management or mobile device management systems, where a tiny little piece of software will be installed on that phone. So this kind of gets to the divide between perhaps a privacy divide between what belongs to the company and what belongs to the individual, but that's a discussion for another time. But they can monitor the activity and on that phone to more give more granular permissions to what the phone can and can't do on the network, what data is living on the phone. I would say relative to what we do, one of the things that we'll do is when you bring that device in, it's going to connect to the network in some fashion, probably over Wi-Fi. Somewhere along the line, that network link will be tapped by one of our devices, and that network traffic is going to end up going to a security tool. So as long as those devices are attached to the physical network, then we have visibility into what they're doing, and we can take some kind of proactive response to what may or may not be acceptable behavior. Now, when you have people working from home or remotely, this definitely gets a lot more complex, and I'm not sure that I have the best answer to how to properly address this. But when people are using their own, for example, I'm using a personal laptop right now to do this call, somewhat business related, and I do all of my work on this laptop. The company has no they have no visibility into what this does until I connect to our native systems. But that does offer opportunity for things to be compromised. In my case, I'm a lot more diligent about my personal security, but your average person shouldn't be. I should say it's kind of a shame that they would have to be so aware of this, and rather than just getting on with their business. But I'd say that's where the training aspect from the company comes in. If you're going to have a lot of remote workers, then you need to have that level of awareness brought up to really advise them of best practices. And there are other, for example, there are other technologies that can help with this, like access controls and identity management. That kind of falls outside of the scope of what our company does. But I'd say just if you're going to go, work on, if you're going to go do work for your company, maybe you shouldn't be connecting to that open Wi-Fi access point at Starbucks, for example. And this all just comes down to that educational aspect. And I think just by virtue of the world we're living in right now, people in general are becoming more aware of these potential dangers. It's becoming a little bit more commonplace to at least understand that there are dangers to attaching to networks. I mean, it's kind of like not locking the doors to your house, I suppose, when you go into these foreign environments and just you don't have any protective measures. And the company can help here too with things like VPNs. You might have seen ads for VPNs online. Corporate VPNs exist too that allow you to securely connect back to the headquarters. And then the cloud brings its own set of challenges, but cloud security is another element of this. But I think that's probably has less to do with the individual user as it does the security team or the network team at the company and how they set that up.
Yeah, I think that. Sorry, Derek, to cut across you.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
I was just going to say, I think from a cultural point of view, and that was one of the points of your question as well, Mark. I think that again, and increasingly we see it now, is to view security as a business enabler rather than a business problem. And by taking that approach, and the organisations, and there are many that do now, and that's what I mean by it becomes ingrained. It's part of the process of doing work. It's a business as usual part of the process now, rather than it being seen as a specific problem that has to be thought about in isolation. It's just part of doing business. And again, the reason that's important is because, of course, as we mentioned at the beginning, these threats come from multiple places into multiple parts of the network, and they're constant. It's a continual situation. So without that wanting to sound too gloomy, it is a continual challenge. But that being said, if we put the right processes in place and take that sort of cultural approach, it's a business enabler that actually, in most instances, that manages those threats. But it is an ongoing situation, so we've had to respond, and organisations have had to respond likewise, that it's now just a normal part of doing business.
Yeah. Okay, guys, that's really good. I did have one final question, but I rather suspect you just answered it actually, Paul, because I was going to say, if you had one piece of advice you could give, say, a law firm, being the audience is going to be watching this, what would it be?
I think and you're right, from my perspective, I guess that would be the answer I would give, is just think of it as a business enabler. And of course, whatever the process and the approach is very relevant to an individual organisation. Again, whether it's a one person or a business, or whether it's a large multinational. So again, as I was saying, the principles are the same; they're just applied on slightly different scales. And that would be the one thing I would say, is just view it as a business enabler, and just think about the processes that protect you, your business, and your data, that give a fair balance for your business operation and the level of security that you need to provide without it being obtrusive and getting in the way of doing business. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, look, thanks both of you, and thanks, Mark, as well, for your support on this chat. I think we've probably covered enough ground for our members to know what your company's about, what the product is that you're offering, the reasons why it should be of interest to them, and the reasons why network security is such a critical part of business today. As you say, Paul, it's an enabler rather than perhaps the traditional old-fashioned perception of it as being a bit of a pain, something you kind of have to do if you want to win business, but it can be seen as a very, very positive aspect to business and business development. So thanks very much for your time on that. Appreciate it very much, and particularly for you, Derek. I guess you've had to get up quite early from America to join us.
Not too bad. No, not bad at all.
So your contact details will be on display at the end of this clip. And to all forum members, I hope you've enjoyed this. We will be doing other fireside chats with other suppliers of services, so watch out for those as they come along in the next few months. Okay, thanks everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Take care.